Welcome to Will I Ever Learn Chinese? In this episode, I'm looking at artificial intelligence and how AI can help us in language learning. Well, compared to my first shaky steps in second language learning in the 1980s, the modern world is just wonderful. Not only are there the wide range of methods that are now available for learning a language, but there's so many tools, online teachers, like-minded learners, etc. And they're just there at our fingertips. We can reach them through the internet. But a new tool has been added to the mix, and this one is very exciting. Artificial intelligence. As I was learning more about artificial intelligence, I was having two different thoughts. Well, would AI eventually take over the need to learn a language? We could, in principle, just use an AI interpretation or translation program, helping us navigate other languages. There would actually no longer be the need for the pain and the fun of learning languages. And indeed, many people rely entirely on AI, and it can also bring people closer together, so this is great. It's obviously brilliant on social media and elsewhere when you encounter a text in a language that you don't speak, and put it into a translation tool, and there is the translation. And the translation is usually pretty good. This is obviously possible for big languages, but what about those small indigenous languages? Many of them don't have this yet. And some indigenous languages, like Kalaallisut, may only have bits of it added to these artificial intelligence or translation programs. So AI can be useful, but I can also see why people would be worried. For example, those in interpreting roles or translators who may think that their workload may eventually be taken over by AI. The other thought I had, however, with respect to AI was something entirely different, and that was more with respect to my own language learning. Could AI help me in learning a language? Well, I did try AI in a number of different ways. And I have talked about my first shaky attempts at trying to speak to my phone's voice assistant already. But I have since also used various other ways of interacting with artificial intelligence and using it in such a way that it has helped me in my language learning. Interestingly, the topic of AI in language learning is also taking off in research. And I attended various research presentations on the use of AI in language learning, and I was intrigued as to how others were getting on with it. There is quite a bit of evidence already that AI is an extremely useful tool when language learning, and it could indeed be described as a true shortcut. Simply put, AI can take the pressure off. It's really good for learning to write and to get feedback. And it can also be used for something called flooding. Basically meaning that you're putting in a request for certain structures you're currently learning, and then ChatGPT gives you these structures and you can see how they're working. So, for example, when I was learning the bar structures in Chinese, I could ask ChatGPT to give me a lot of different bar structures in a lot of different situations, and ChatGPT would quite happily do so, pretty much within a few seconds. Another issue, though, is that ChatGPT can also be very good at correcting you, but it not being human, it doesn't feel quite as harsh, so you're not really losing face as a learner, but rather ChatGPT criticizes you, well, so what? I'm not so sure about this, because negative feedback can hurt, and you just have to get over this feeling of negative feedback hurting and turning it into something positive. And I have to say, the other way around, there also seems to be this little bit where ChatGPT is actually praising you that is brilliant. So on those occasions when my writing was pretty okay and ChatGPT actually said so, I was incredibly pleased with myself. Overall though, ChatGPT took a lot of pressure off, and it really helped me build my confidence in writing in a very short period of time. So, for example, in my conversation lessons, my teacher would say something that I didn't quite get. And it got lost in the conversation, I noted something down, but then never really got to follow it up. For example, my teacher said something that was supposed to mean time flies, but what she had said was not really in my dictionary, and I had written something down but got it slightly wrong. I knew that there was an expression, 时间过得真快. Time goes really fast. And this meant something similar, but what she had said wasn't quite the same. So I asked ChatGPT, and I said it sounds a bit like this, and gave the approximate pronunciation. And ChatGPT came back with the correct answer and said, well, the expression you are probably referring to is 时间如飞. Time flies fast. This means the same as 时间过得真快. Oh, okay, so I've got it. And I managed to get it just by asking ChatGPT. So this was no longer just my writing, but now also my understanding and my spoken language was benefiting from using artificial intelligence. I also remembered a phrase from my initial learning program. I had learned it at the time, I probably knew how to write it, but I had not really used it much. And crucially, I had not really heard it said much either. So I wasn't too sure whether I could use it, whether it would be very formal or maybe very informal, and whether it would be right in context. So I tentatively used it with one of my teachers at one point, watching their face carefully to see if I was pronouncing it correctly and if what I was saying was okay. And they didn't seem too surprised, so it was probably okay. But I decided to ask ChatGPT. I got one of the words slightly wrong because I didn't quite remember how it was pronounced and I wrote something wrong down. So I asked ChatGPT, that depends on the situation. How would you give that in Chinese and what different levels of formality are there? And ChatGPT complied and gave me various different forms. So very casual, more polite, very polite. But the expression I was after wasn't there. So I wrote down, well, can you actually say something like 去出于 or similar? And ChatGPT said, well, there is a phrase like that, but it doesn't quite convey the meaning of that depends on the situation. However, there's another phrase that is 出介于, which means that depends. So you could use it to express that depends on the situation and the circumstances. So again, through asking, it sounds a bit like this, could it possibly be something in that direction? ChatGPT came up with an answer, and it gave me the simplified characters, it gave me the pinyin, transcript, the tones, it gave me the entire way in which this expression was used. I was also using ChatGPT for my writing, as I mentioned earlier. And it was brilliant because I could put in a piece of writing and would get instantaneous feedback. So I wouldn't have to give it to a teacher and potentially embarrass myself. I wouldn't have to write it very carefully, even though writing it very carefully is usually a good idea. So the way I was doing this for now was I would spend some time perfecting a piece of writing, put it into the artificial intelligence program, and then ask it to correct my writing. For example, when I first contacted my female conversation teacher, this was one of the first times I was using ChatGPT to correct my writing. So I wrote an email and I made it as perfect as I possibly could. I was pretty pleased with the final result, and I put this into ChatGPT and I said, correct my writing, please. Now, ChatGPT went through this and had just a few corrections, but some of them were really quite excellent because they made my language more fluent and they worked a bit better in that situation. So I may have used an extremely formal word next to a not so formal word, and ChatGPT corrected that to a stylistically more appropriate wording. However, there was something not quite right, and I realized that when I carefully looked through the response that ChatGPT had been giving me. I said in the email pretty much towards the end that I am a linguist, and ChatGPT then automatically assumed that I would be teaching the class. So rather than approaching a teacher asking them if they would be willing to teach me, I was actually saying that I was going to teach the class now. Wow, at least I picked this one up, because had I sent this to my potential teacher, well, she would have been a bit confused, if anything. So this shows that you can't just blindly trust AI, but rather AI might make some assumptions that are not quite right. And you just have to use your own judgments too. Apart from ChatGPT, I used a range of other programs, and I also used translation tools. So this is something like Google Translate and the like, where you put a sentence in and you get a sentence in the other language back. And as my Chinese was improving, I was using such tools more and more. and I found them extremely helpful. But again, I was using them mainly for checking, so thinking what the wording would be like first, putting it into the tool, and then seeing whether the result would be more or less similar to what I had initially thought. What I really liked about this type of setting was that you could just press a button and the program would say the entire sentence back to you with the correct tones. Admittedly, it would be an electronic voice, but if you just needed to imitate the tones or get a bit of a feeling for how it was pronounced, this was a really marvelous tool, a really marvelous way of finding out. Back to the question I asked in the beginning. Do we still need to learn languages now that translation programs and artificial intelligence can do it for us? Well, learning a language is not really about translation. There's a totally different approach behind it. It's about self-discovery, in my opinion. So letting go of your assumptions and your prejudices. It's about immersing yourself in a new world and learning new things. Going totally and utterly outside your comfort zone and then experiencing the not knowing again. And for a lifelong learner, for an educator, this is absolutely invaluable. Being able to put yourself in the shoes of the learner and experience the process of learning. So being the other, gaining an understanding of what others are going through, and at the same time learning something new. And for me, it's not just about the language, even though it may start out that way, but later it all becomes the culture and the feelings and everything else that is associated with the language, that is intrinsically linked with the language. Suddenly I start to understand where people are coming from, and I see what initially seemed rather exotic or maybe scary becoming familiar, and then strangers becoming close friends. Language learning opens up a whole different world, and it is urgently needed in times of conflict and inward looking. If you could speak any language, learn it immediately, for example through a brain implant, would you do it? Well, I would be tempted, I have to say, but I quite cherish the process of learning. So, AI has had a big impact on how people can communicate with one another. And it will make a big difference to mutual understanding in the future. At least that's what I hope. Still, to me there's something utterly magical about learning languages that no artificial intelligence program can capture, and it's about this fully immersing myself in the language, losing myself in the language, and learning a lot about the culture, the history, the hopes and the fears, and simply the humanity of the speakers that speak that language. It brings the other closer. It lets me partake, rather than just being an outside observer.